Today we're unboxing an iPad 2 that I purchased on eBay as being in open box condition. This listing was actually an auction and I won it for only $39 plus shipping. The listing itself was relatively vague. There were not any pictures of the device actually powered on. However, there was a photo of the back of the box where I was able to find the serial number for the device. And after plugging that into Apple's website, it was reported that the device has never been activated. But anyway, let's go ahead and get this box opened up to see what we have. Okay, and here we go. This is the iPad 2 in its original box. And importantly, we see that this one has the iPod app on the home screen, so we should be running the original software version, iOS 4. Here on the back of the box, we can see that this is the very desirable top-end 64GB storage configuration. That is very cool because the vast majority of these are the base model 16GB. So let's go ahead and lift open the box now. And just using the pull tab to lift up the iPad. And yeah, this is definitely looking very open box to me so far. Let's take a look at the back panel here. This does not really appear to have ever been removed from this plastic envelope. As far as the accessories included in the box, we have the 10-watt USB power adapter here, as well as a USB to 30-pin cable. And lastly here for the literature packet, we have a quick start guide as well as some warranty info and 2 Apple stickers. But getting back to the iPad itself here, one of the biggest things that I am worried about is the battery. Oftentimes open box or brand new sealed devices will have batteries that do not accept a charge. And that's just because they can actually sustain damage after sitting unused for such a long time. But I definitely intend to shoot my shot with this one here, so let's go ahead and turn it over to release the device from its envelope. Okay, and perfect. This iPad is looking really nice so far. So let's get right to the moment of truth here. I'll go ahead and connect my 30-pin cable to see if the battery on this device will accept a charge. And okay, it sadly looks like we are getting the Apple logo right away, which is not usually a good sign. And okay, it looks like the device has booted into the iOS 4 activation screen. However, we are seeing a red flag up in the top right where the battery icon is showing an outlet plug. This of course means that the device thinks it is fully charged. So I'm going to unplug the device here, and yes, it dies instantly. But I'm going to reconnect the 30-pin here just in case we get a different result the second try. And okay, well, it's pretty much a miracle here, but something about the second try of charging the device looks like it's going to allow it to charge up normally. This has actually never happened to me. Usually if a device shows a sign of boot looping, like the battery is totally bad, it will never actually charge up. But yeah, it looks like today might be my lucky day, so I'm just going to leave the iPad here for a few hours to charge up. Okay, and just a few hours later, I now have the iPad 2 fully charged up. So let's go through this iOS 4 activation process by first connecting the device to a Mac. And there we go, just like that, the iPad has been activated. So here we are met with the iOS 4 lock screen. One distinctive feature of this version is the dark gray or black arrow on this slide to unlock button. I want to say this was changed in iOS 5.1 to a lighter gray. But anyway, let's go ahead and slide to unlock now. And there we go. Wow, it's so cool to see this iOS 4 home screen. As I said at the beginning of the video, this was the last version to feature the iPod app on the home screen. So that application feels really nostalgic and rare. Let's jump into settings so we can find out which version of iOS 4 we have. And okay, cool. It looks like we have 4.3.3 here. The iPad 2 released about halfway into the iOS 4 lifecycle, so its first version was iOS 4.3. And I believe the last version of iOS 4 for this was 4.3.5. So having 4.3.3 is pretty much middle of the road. And it's really cool there to see confirmation of the 64GB capacity. I'm really thrilled with this iPad so far, and I'm super happy that the battery decided to hold a charge. I was definitely doubtful about that at the beginning of the video when the device was showing signs of boot looping. But since everything has worked out with this, I'm going to spend a little bit of time with it, get some content synced to it, and then we will take a closer look at it. Okay, well, I've got the iPad 2 here all set up how I like, so let's go ahead and talk about its history. This model was released in March 2011, just under 1 year after the original iPad launched. And this was the last piece of hardware to be announced by Steve Jobs himself. It featured a pretty much all new design that was radically thinner and lighter than the original model. So bringing in one of those here, you can see how radical of a design change this was year over year. The iPad 2 is now 33% thinner as well as 15% lighter. And aside from that, the design itself was just quite different. So while the first iPad had more squared off edges with a bowed design back panel, the iPad 2 had more tapered edges with a flat back panel. Although the basic size footprint was the same. As you can see, both of these had an aluminum back panel with a black Apple logo. They also both had the same 9.7-inch display. So these were both non-retina and non-laminated with a resolution of 1024 by 768. But another big hallmark feature of the iPad 2 was the addition of 2 cameras. That was a big complaint of the original model as it did not feature any at all. Both of the cameras on the iPad 2 were pretty bad quality, but it was just really cool to have them at all. The rear camera was 720p quality, while the front-facing camera was VGA quality. So yeah, nothing very impressive here at all, but it was really cool to have for features like FaceTime and Photo Booth. The iPad 2 also got a nice bump in processing power, so it was now using the dual-core A5 chip. So this was the first product to feature that, and it also doubled the RAM amount from 256 megabytes to 512. Those specs made this iPad a lot more future-proof than the original. This received software support through iOS 9, while the original only received support through iOS 5. Although performance with the later supported versions on the iPad 2 were definitely struggling. Especially with iOS 8 and 9 on these, those were pretty laggy. But of course here running iOS 4, the device absolutely flies. The pricing and connectivity structure was the same for the iPad 2 as the original, so you could get a Wi-Fi only model or Wi-Fi and 3G. The pricing started at $499 for a 16GB model, but you could step up $100 or $200 for 32 or 64 gigabytes. So the original price for the 64GB model I have here would have been $699, which was pretty hefty, especially in 2011. This iPad was sold new by Apple for a really long time, all the way through early 2014. So you could purchase these new with iOS 4, 5, 6, and 7. But this was a really legendary iPad, especially in its time. Aside from the lower performance that didn't come into play until this device was much older, the only downfall here was really the display. The panel quality itself was really nice, it had great off-axis viewing angles. But the resolution was just a little bit low, so certain details close up could get a little bit grainy. You may be able to see that here, especially with the battery percentage. But that wasn't a huge deal at all, especially if you would hold the device away from a normal distance. And Apple did end up bringing the Retina display to the iPad just 1 year after this. And when that third generation model came out, the price dropped on this iPad to $399. And that's really where Apple sold a ton of these, as it kind of served as more of the budget-oriented iPad. But now we will turn our attention to iOS 4 on this device specifically. So one of the biggest features of this version was the addition of multitasking. This was clearly a pretty crude first iteration, but it was still really nice to have. So just double-clicking the home button kind of moved all of your content upward and gave you this small multitasking pane across the bottom. You would only get previews of your app icons, but just clicking any of these would bring you back to them. And the process for closing out an application involved holding them down until they went into this wiggle mode, and then pressing the small red minus buttons to actually close them. So that was a lot of steps, and it wasn't overly intuitive, but it worked for the time. And especially when considering the processing power available on devices that supported this, it made sense. Something else new for iOS 4 here was Game Center. And this was fun to kind of share scores and compete in games with friends, especially as games were becoming so popular with iOS. Also new for iOS 4 was the ability to put your applications into folders. So that was just a nice way to organize your home screen. As you can see here, the folders have a very nostalgic look with this linen background. But having folders also meant that you could just have more apps on your device. And that was cool, especially for devices with a large amount of storage here like the 64GB model. Also, the FaceTime video calling feature was new for iOS 4 as it launched back in mid-2010 on the iPhone 4. Obviously, FaceTime is commonplace today, but back in 2010 it was so cool to video call someone from a mobile device. And as it was available here on the iPad, that was just another product it expanded to. It was also available on the iPod Touch as of late 2010. iOS 4 was actually a larger update for iPhone and iPod Touch rather than iPads, because you are now able to set a home screen wallpaper on those devices. And there was also this new reflective style dock. The home screen wallpaper was only supported on devices that were powerful enough for it, so the iPhone 3GS are newer and the iPod Touch 3rd generation are newer. But it's kind of interesting because the home screen wallpaper as well as that newer dock were present on the original iPad even with the iPhone OS 3 version. And something else interesting about iOS 4 is that it's almost more interesting to discuss what it did not have. So here for the iPad as well as the iPod Touch, you would not find a messages application, as this did not have iMessage. That would come later with iOS 5. Also going along with that, iOS 4 here did not have iCloud, so you wouldn't get that really seamless syncing across your devices that came with that feature. Here in settings, if you go into Mail, Contacts, and Calendars, you will see something that predated iCloud. And that was of course Mobile Me that sort of attempted to be something like iCloud, although this was a paid service, so that really flopped. Also missing in iOS 4 is Notification Center, so you'll see that it's not available. That also came with iOS 5. And that also brought with it the banner style notification. So here on iOS 4, you have the older style persistent notifications. Those would come up in the center of your screen and require immediate action. Something iOS 4 definitely still had was integration with Google applications, so you had a built-in YouTube app here. This no longer natively works in 2025, but it's still really cool to just see all of the options that were here. And it's pretty crazy that this Google functionality used to be built into every iOS device right out of the box. You also had Google Maps here, which actually does still work in 2025. I've dropped a pin here near an Apple store and you are still able to access Google Street View. So yeah, here is a look at the Apple store I recently visited. Also, one more point about the multitasking interface here is that it actually had some hidden controls to the left. So you had your media controls here as well as screen brightness and rotation lock. This was pretty cool and it almost felt like a precursor to the control center that wouldn't come until iOS 7. We'll also take a look at the default wallpapers here for iOS 4. So we have a nice selection here, including the default for this version with the water droplets. There was also the default here for the original iPad, as well as the globe image, which was synonymous with the first iPhone, as well as plenty of other nice skeuomorphic choices. For this device though, I think I'm just going to leave the water droplet default. We'll also take a look at the apps that I was able to get synced onto this device. These came from an older version of iTunes, so I was really glad to have classic games like Temple Run here. I remember one of my friends got an iPad 2 back in 2011. I was actually in 4th grade at the time, and I was so jealous of her being able to play Temple Run on this. Something else funny to take a look at here is how some of these applications will open up in an iPhone resolution. So for example, Paper Toss here was not optimized for the large screen on the iPad just yet. Instead, it launches by default in this small mode, and you can press this 2x button in the bottom right to expand it. This means that the application itself is pretty blurry, but you are still able to use it. I remember this was pretty common for several years after the iPad launched, as it just took developers a while to develop iPad versions for all of their apps. Also, I did sync my music to this iPad, so it's cool to use the old iPod application. As I said, this was before Apple split the iPod app into music and videos for the iPad and iPhone. So that pretty much concludes my look at this iPad 2 here. Really cool that I was able to purchase this in open box condition on eBay and the battery accepted a charge. As you can see here, it's still on 80% and I've been using it a pretty decent amount. Let me know if you think this was one of the most revolutionary iPads ever made. It was certainly a crazy year-over-year improvement from the original. Thank you guys so much for watching and I'll see you in the next one.